Did that last week too. Didn't hit the go live for some reason. That last week too. Did Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, May 11th, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today continues Phase 3 with our 14th webinar in the series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and the chairman of our committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning this facilitation of this webinar over to right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. It is once again a great pleasure to be with you and all of our other colleagues. We are indeed continuing our discussion concerning topic 8 of the document Revelation Revealed. I would say to those of our viewers who may not have the document on hand and available that it would be a very good idea for you to download it from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The link is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. The word Global Endeavor is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. And the link to the document Revelation Revealed is near the bottom of the homepage. In addition, because viewers on YouTube have no possibility of asking us questions while we are conducting the webinar, we offer you the possibility of sending in a question in writing by writing to the email address listed at the bottom of the homepage, namely info@globalendeavor.net. If you wish to send a question, please write us concerning something that someone said or some issue that arose or just an idea of yours inspired by our program. If we decide to use your question during a future broadcast, we reserve the right to edit it. And in that event, the question that you have submitted would be considered by the entire group of panelists, not simply receiving an answer from myself personally. So today we are, in effect, discussing the consequences or the overtones of one paragraph on page 109 of Revelation Revealed. It is in the major section called Christianity, Key Features and Practices. And this particular paragraph is paragraph C in that section, called Doctrines and Creeds. Because it is short, I shall read it, only 4 lines. Although the atonement can correctly be considered Christianity's most prominent doctrine, the religion also advances a range of other standard teachings amounting to methods intended to guide and control believers, while simultaneously promoting uniformity and discouraging original, imaginative, or creative thinking. Now, we began discussing this paragraph and what it implies last week. We talked about general issues that the wording implies, and we then proceeded to take account of a statement that the Midwear Commission makes in the second paragraph of section 8 of paper 195. This section is called Secular Totalitarianism, but this short set of 2 sentences that we are particularly working on go from the opposite direction, domination by religion. I read them as follows. The mother of modern secularism was the totalitarian Christian church. Secularism had its inception as a rising protest against the almost complete domination of Western civilization by the institutionalized Christian church. Now, as a matter of history, this situation of complete domination or near complete domination lasted 1,000 years, from approximately 500 CE to 1500 CE. During that time, the Christian church, the Roman Catholic Church, where there was only one, had a monopoly on education. It had a monopoly on teaching. It had a monopoly on theology. It had a monopoly on philosophy. Furthermore, it had an active liaison with the governments of the day, and in effect was in partnership, an effective partnership that can correctly be understood as either the union of church and state or perhaps the interpenetration of church and state, the 2 elements operating in close linkages. Excuse me. So at the end of the webinar last week, we began reading from a segment of a lecture on philosophy that I found extremely interesting in portraying the difficulties that ensued for everyday life, whereby the organized church was dominating everything, at least everything intellectual or involving any process of thought. I read 2 paragraphs, but before we revert to that, let me talk a little bit about the lecture involved. This is by Professor Daniel N. Robinson, part of a lecture that he entitled Hippocrates and the Science of Life, Hippocrates being an ancient Greek physician. And this lecture was part of a course called The Great Ideas of Philosophy, second edition, dated 2004. This series of lectures is available from a company called The Great Courses, or the Teaching Company. It's available on CDs or on DVDs. And I enjoyed following this course by CD quite some years ago and transcribed the particular segment that corresponds to our interest today. In any event, here we go. For those of you who are on the mailing list of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, I attached a copy of this 2-page segment from the philosophy lecture to my announcement message that I sent out yesterday evening. Even though I read the first two paragraphs last week. I think it would be useful to repeat them. Bob, would you read these first two paragraphs, please, again, starting now this perspective?
Sure. Now this perspective becomes a perspective available only to those who have not accepted priestcraft as having epistemological authority. Whatever problems are to be addressed by oracles and priests, the problem of knowledge is not one of them, at least as this problem arises from the facts of the natural world. And I do not want to underscore this. It is a point worth repeating. Something momentous takes place when a culture takes the position of the problem of knowledge is essentially a religious problem and invests its credulity in a denominated group of official interpreters whose judgments on matters of this kind are taken to be incorrigible. Here I do not presume to weigh the claims of religion and the claims of the secular world. My own guess is that for every secularly produced fact, there may be some profound religious truth on which it depends. But here, the complexity of the case and the shortness of life incline me, at any rate, to silence. What I am testing instead are the implications that follow, depending upon which of the positions is taken as a person or culture sets out to solve problems arising from life in the real world.
Thank you, Bob. Here, the two paragraphs include a number of unusual words that perhaps need to be discussed as ideas or as vocabulary. When I circulated this text as an attachment to my announcement message, it included a third page in which some definitions are given. Charles, I would ask you perhaps to help out the viewers, because many of them will not have that explanatory set of definitions available. Specifically, I ask you to focus on three words in the first paragraph: priestcraft, epistemological, and the final word in that first paragraph, incorrigible. And could you please give us your understanding of these three words?
Mm-hmm. I'll begin. Incorrigible would mean you can't penetrate it. It would be invulnerable. It would be immune to criticism. With some of the implications, I think, meaning it cannot be qualified or corrupted either way. It is near perfect or perfect.
Could I paraphrase this? I'm sorry. Could I paraphrase your explanation as saying no one has a right to object or correct the other person if that person is incorrigible?
Well, that's a possible implication, yes. As to no one has the right, that's probably, we have such behavior in the context of our Bill of Rights, the American Bill of Rights, and still people have the right. So I wouldn't it's an attitude of being impervious, seemingly claiming to be impervious to criticism, we'll put it that way.
Okay, so the person who is described as incorrigible at least would be proclaiming that his or her views were not subject to correction. Is that fair?
It is from the point of view of those who believe that, yes.
Okay.
And I have to qualify it that way. I guess it's the independent streak in me or something. With regard to
fine, because the word incorrigible can be used in other contexts. For example, in education, yes, there is a phrase called an incorrigible child. And I mentioned that you had a few incorrigibles during your many years of experience as a teacher. But I think in this case, it has to do with people, organizations, in this case, priests and clerical authorities proclaiming that their view was not to be corrected or challenged.
Well, that is one of the, historically speaking, that is one of the groups or types of groups that make such a claim. It suggests that they cannot be, there's no point trying to correct them or reform them because they're not reformable or correctable. But that can be, it can be used a number of ways.
That's fine. Could you go on to the other two words I asked you about, priestcraft and epistemological?
priestcraft would be a name simply for a specialized institution in society. An institution is defined as status relationships, particular roles, and norms, roles, and status relationships. That each role has a status and so forth, and there are relationships between people of the same status and different statuses. So priestcraft would be obviously in a religious context. You wouldn't use that term for a political party or a scientific symposium or group. It would be used for something religious, some kind of religious set of aims and goals, objectives, and means and methods. Epistemological simply refers to human knowledge and all of its possibilities. That human knowledge, one could say, is finite. That's a finite. It has limits, inherent limits, because we humans are finite. In any case, it's the main focus would be on human knowledge and the scope and depth of human knowledge. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so let me now, if I am permitted, ask you to parse the opposite of the first two lines, who have not accepted priestcraft as having epistemological authority. And the opposite I would like you to parse would be those who have accepted priestcraft as having epistemological authority. What would that mean?
Well, that's quite interesting. It has at least two features to it, perhaps dimensions to it. In one case, groups that have power of knowledge or specialized authority or specialized control, some degree of specialized control, tend to perpetuate that and expand upon it. On the other side, they have followers, people who obey and expected to obey. In my opinion, there are many men and women. I can't give a percentage of the human race, of humanity, or any particular race or class or civilization or society, but there are a number of people in humanity who want to be led, they want to follow. And so the epistemology of a priestcraft that would invest them with the authority of knowledge and the exclusive authority of knowledge, in this instance, oftentimes exclusive, would satisfy such individuals who wish to be led and wish to follow to the full. They don't want to be on their own in a philosophical, intellectual, or theological sense. They prefer to be led we see this kind of behavior in, again, in the political realm. We see it in commercial realms through modern advertising, particularly modern advertising, since the 1920s especially. It's effective because people do wish to be led. So I think that would be the opposite. You have those who not only accept it, but do so willingly and with some degree of satisfaction. And there are those who will do the leading, and that group, that organization, that institution, from what I've observed, would largely see itself in the light of being a higher authority in the context of religion, if it's a priestcraft. But it would apply to any group that has considerable authority. Again, political parties, etc.
Okay, now let's come down to the particular case that that the lecturer concerning philosophy is addressing. The implication of his first two sentences, at least, is that he believes that in the period we're examining, the period of the Middle Ages from 500 to 1500, the organized institutional church proclaimed that it had the authority to make pronouncements on all matters whatsoever. Is that a fair statement, Charles?
I think so. I think the later Middle Ages watched totalitarianism in the Christian church rise up in one form or another. Especially I'm going to see from somewhere roughly, I would say the 12th century through the 15th, 16th. Indeed, it ultimately led to the Protestant Reformation.
Yes, and I have picked out the termination date of 1500, specifically with the Protestant Reformation in mind. As of that time, the authority of the Roman Catholic Church was indeed strongly contested, and its authority to make pronouncements on any subject was under siege by the reformers, many of whom made valid points. But we're talking about this period of 1,000 years in which the authority of the institutional church, the Christian church, which now is identified as the Roman Catholic Church because there wasn't any other possibility, proclaimed itself master of all aspects of human life. Now, I'd like Bob to turn to the second sentence in that first paragraph that he read. Whatever problems are to be addressed by oracles and priests, the problem of knowledge is not one of them, at least as this problem arises from the facts of the natural world. And now, before I give him the opportunity to reply, I would like to emphasize to the viewers that what we are doing here is examining the comments of a philosophy professor. This is not the Urantia book, and indeed it is not Revelation Revealed, our primary document. But in my judgment, the lecturer on philosophy is making interesting points that helps us understand the relationship of the church, of the organized institutional church during this period of time of 1,000 years that we are examining. So Bob, with that long prologue now, please give your opinions on what this means in the second sentence.
Let me read it once more, just so we are a little bit ground set. Whatever problems are to be addressed by oracles and priests, the problem of knowledge is not one of them, at least as this problem arises from the facts of the natural world. So I think what he's doing here is taking, and you can see throughout this lecture, is that he's taking a juxtaposition and showing a juxtaposition between religion or spirit and matter. Knowledge is the study of knowledge, which is called epistemology, as Charles brought up, is a complex situation in itself. The Japanese think that knowledge is something that is called ba, and it's not something that you can grasp and put your draw an object to. Now I consider Japanese Western thinkers at this point, but I also think that there's a difference between the way that the material world looks at knowledge. So what I think he's doing here in this particular paragraph, or I should say in this sentence, is that natural philosophy, which started with the Greeks, Aristotle, Socrates, etc., were more concerned with the natural world. While they had a religion, I think they had a religion, albeit it was a mythical religion. Those two were separated via this idea called the natural philosophy that was their it was their theory of knowledge. It was their theory of epistemology. How do we gain knowledge of the natural world? What I thought was interesting is in the next paragraph, if I could just bring this up quickly to make a point of why I was separating those two, is he says, my own guess is that for every secularly produced fact, there may be some profound religious truth, which it depends. Almost sounds like a paradox. The note that I made there was that I would change that word, those two words, religious truth, to say cosmic truth, because I think that's what the Urantia papers have pursued. We're trying to increase not only our religious understanding, our spiritual experiences, but to understand that in a cosmic setting. So, but this particular two paragraphs are at least setting the stage for what he's going to say, a little bit later, in that the idea of the natural world, i.e., how do we gain our knowledge of the natural world, versus this mysterious side of the religious side, I think is where he's taking this.
Thank you. I would offer a comment or perhaps an analytical point from my own perspective that may be helpful as we go along. At least I hope it will be. And it seems to me that the underlying content of these 2 pages by the lecturer on philosophy really, from our understanding based on the teachings of the Urantia book, has to do with the intersection and relationships among the 3 elements of finite reality that the revelators talk about: matter, mind, and spirit. And I believe it would be inappropriate to restrict the content of this philosophy lecturer's remarks just to matter. I believe he is not talking only about material substance, the definition of carbon and how carbon interacts with other atoms and so on. That is included. He is also, by implication, talking about mind and the operations of mind in a very practical sense. So, for example, in the professional field that Bob pursues, computer technology, information technology, and so on, there is a certain amount of knowledge as to how a program works, how a computer works, how data are transferred from one location to the other. I doubt that one would really want to call that science. It may have a technical side to it, but it is part of this interplay of mind that we all deal with. The performance of stocks in the stock market is not science, but it is mind. And so it seems to me that these 3 elements are implicitly intertangled, interwoven in the comments of the lecturer on philosophy, and that in essence, what he is describing is a period in history when those who claimed to speak for spirit asserted domination over matter and mind in addition to domination over spirit. George, would you look at the final sentence in the first paragraph that Bob read about something momentous takes place? Maybe you can read it for us and then comment.
Sure. Where are we? Something momentous takes place when a culture takes the position that the problem of knowledge is essentially a religious problem and invests its credulity in a denominated group of official interpreters whose judgments on matters of this kind are taken to be incorrigible.
Please feel free to comment on that. You do not have to agree with the sentence, but I hope you will at least explain what the professor is seeking to say.
Okay, well, I think he's simply making the distinction, or the primary distinction he appears to be making is between matters of belief and matters of fact. Fact being associated in this context with things which are observable, and belief being, of course, about things which are not observable. So he's saying if observable facts are evaluated or judged or ruled upon by those whose province of knowledge is the invisible, religion, what is believed in and not seen, then it makes has a tremendous effect on the course of culture and society. Your whole premise of this section, I believe, is that the Catholic Church imposed certain beliefs certain belief system, a certain set of dogmatic beliefs on Western civilization. And this changed the evolution, growth, progress of Western civilization for well over a millennium. If they had made a different choice where they restricted the reach of their authority to religious and spiritual matters instead of venturing into material matters, which are more properly the province of science, obviously the outcome would have been far different than it was. So I think that's the point he's trying to make here.
Thank you. I agree with the general line of explanation that you've offered, George. Thank you very much. I would say that in addition to the facts of science in the material world, there is a whole domain of intellectual discourse. So, for example, the facts of science have nothing to do with the grammar of French. That's not a scientific matter. That's a cultural matter. The facts of science have nothing to do with an explanation of the works of Shakespeare. Likewise, an intellectual matter, a cultural matter. And I submit also that the facts of science have very little to do with the dimensions of psychology involved in human relationships. For example, relationships between husband and wife. Science has almost nothing to say about that. And the problem of the authority of the Roman Catholic Church is that it claimed the authority to make statements about all of the above and to make these statements binding on believers as a matter of authority. So, for example, last week we talked about the fact that, as Charles had said in a story, that Galileo had noticed in his telescope that there were 4 moons about Jupiter, circling around Jupiter. And a cardinal objected, but that's unimportant, that's irrelevant. So effectively, Galileo's observation of those moons transcended the theological precepts that the cardinal was proclaiming, the authority of the Roman Catholic Church to make pronouncements on all subjects whatsoever. So another example of the authority had to do with the church's authority over marriage and divorce. The procedures for annulling a marriage became very litigious and so on. So, Doreen, I'd like to ask you to comment on the implications of a situation in society, in this case, the society in the Middle Ages, in which the religious institution went well beyond what we understand to be the proper field of religion and adopted all sorts of rules and regulations about social behavior and social norms.
Well, I really found it interesting, and I started to do a lot of research on the things that they had said. And I found that, what you were talking about, science observes facts, right? And movement and the property, of matter. And what they did, instead of thinking about where do thoughts come from and how do you analyze the idea of medicine and illness, and what they came up with, I found it amazing, just amazing. That's why I hate reading this stuff in the Middle Ages. It's so evil and negative, and it just disturbs me. The only thing I really did enjoy was reading, again, Platoism, because when I had it in college so many years ago, it really brought back such beauty to me and truths. But when the church said illness was indisputably, there was no question about it, caused by sin. That was, and the Bible said so. This is what they were professing. And the only the only alternative explanation was demonic possession. So they came up with all these fallacies. I don't know how to justify. I don't know if they even examined it, but they had no answers. So they came up with the most ludicrous, the most insane answers to feed the people. People died as a result because they wouldn't allow medicine. They wouldn't allow science. They, fought. It's a reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. It never comes to the aid of spiritual things, but more frequently struggles against the divine word. Reason struggles against thought. I just could not believe that, how they profess to put this out. And of course, the poor people of the time, so backward and having no other authority, you weren't even allowed to question what they said. So, they only holy people like the church could perform miracles. And if you touch the hem of a holy, a queen or someone, you would be healed. I mean, which is absolute, that's not science, it's not thinking, it's not reasoning. I think they just made it up from, the primitive religions. But in further reading, the ancient times, they were so far ahead before the church came into being with all their doctrines. They said reason is God's crowning gift to man. Sophocles said that. And it was like, there were so many wonderful things they professed, and they had answers to diseases and all kinds, but the church didn't want to hear it. So how would it affect, how would it affect society, how would it affect the thinking? I can, in looking at all of it in totality, at first I couldn't understand where you were coming from with all this and why are we delving into it. But when I saw that it all really does tie together, it ties to, how even when we come to the end and we'll talk about the angels, the what you had given us and all their divisions of operation on the planet and what they have to deal with, I could see the connection from the beginning to the end and how, it progressed and then degressed, or however you say, devolved into something crazy, and how people during the medieval times, I would say, I can't think of the word, when the rebirth came, the Renaissance, and how, of course, something refreshing, something good. Here they were offering, you can't bathe. I mean, just how does it affect life? Germs, it's because God gave you those germs, you have to keep them. Don't bathe but once or twice a year for the queen. And this to me was, oh my God. Where did these people, they had Jesus's teachings, right? Where in the Bible, where it said, don't clean yourself? It's beyond me, because as I was reading, it was saying the Muslims, that they said, wash your hands before eating. Well, according to the Christians, that was blasphemy. You don't do that. So I really enjoyed the discovery of so many different areas on that topic alone, that it took me quite a long time to put it together. But anyway, I'll allow somebody else to speak. I probably didn't answer your question anyway.
Doreen, you made quite a few interesting comments. I have to tell you that I'm very heartened by the fact that when you went through all this, you finally understood what I was trying to get at.
Yeah. Otherwise, I said, why this and why that?
And that eventually it made sense to you, although it was puzzling at first. Thank you.
Well, Neil.
Charles, I was going to turn to you in just a minute. Can I give you a prelude before you interject your ideas, or do you want to speak first and then I give you a little bit more?
No, go ahead.
All right. I think at some point, either last week or previous week, you talked about facts, meanings, and values. And indeed, those are an extremely useful, those words are an extremely useful way of portraying the entire reality of mind and spirit that we're dealing with. One can say that facts are strongly associated with the material world, that meanings probably are associated with mind, and values have a high correlation with spirit. Do these three words to you, in effect, convey the idea of the entirety of the domain that the clerics of the Middle Ages sought to dominate?
I'm not sure as to the entirety. Probably not, because there were individuals, particular men and women. Hildegard of Bingen was one, Thomas Aquinas another, and there were still others whose names I can't remember, who might come under the heading of reformers or correctors of this perspective of totalitarian authority. Thomas Aquinas, for example, in the 13th century, early 13th century, was of the view, I think this is correct, I read all of his writings on angels because I have a personal interest in that, and it seems to support what I'm going to say. Thomas Aquinas, who is considered one of the great church fathers, he's ranked very highly. He's meaning a great philosopher, a great teacher. He thought that reason was an ally of faith, or reason should be thought of as an ally of faith. There were some in the church, clerics, other clerics, who were put off by that in a negative sense. They didn't like it. They found it to be distasteful. Nonetheless, he proposed that. And it's led some individuals who are closer students of this subject than I am to suggest that the beginning of the modern world might well have been what he wrote. This notion that reason can be an ally of faith. And that's how I heard it phrased, and I think that's very interesting. There were individuals like Hildegard of Bingen or Teresa of Avila, the great Spanish mystic. The Inquisition confiscated, she lived in the 16th century, but which is the other end of our chronology. The Inquisition confiscated one of her books, which I've read, a translation. And it was based on her spiritual experiences, her vision, her visionary mindset, and not directly on scripture per se. That's why they were suspicious. That's nothing new at that time. They didn't suddenly decide on that. That's an indication of a totalitarian mindset. But there were men and women in the Christian tradition during this period of that one could characterize as totalitarian, who questioned it for various reasons. And their questioning is notable because they were loyal to the church, Christian world, Christian church. They were loyal to it. This extends back into the Middle Ages, some centuries prior to the Reformation. For example, Aquinas was certainly prior, as was Hildegard as well, and there are others. What I'm driving at is the Christian, we don't want to overgeneralize. The totalitarian nature of Christianity at this time is referenced in the Urantia book. So better minds than I have observed this. Notwithstanding that, nonetheless, within Christianity there were cultural channels of original thinking, some degree of original thinking, and spirituality, or emphasizing one or the other, or both, combining both. And for a complex of reasons, Christianity, the potential of Christianity to correct itself, that is, to be more thoughtful, more creative, to look at reason as an ally of faith, was present, but it didn't take hold. It didn't really take hold, which is why when astronomy, which I think was the first really modern science for us, from our point of view, emerged, it was questioned on the basis of its non-scriptural frame of reference. And verification was non-scriptural, as indicated. As far as I know, that Galileo was criticized on that point, that this was knowledge that was not important. that kind of reaction did have individuals who might have had a mitigating effect, but possibly did not in the overall sense. The Ranch book also points out that within the Christian frame of reference, there are cultural channels of thought that have a rehabilitative potential vis-a-vis the totalitarian aspects. And the church has not just the Protestant Reformation, which changed a lot of things. There are aspects, interesting aspects of manifestations of what happened to Christianity during that period of time. In my opinion, it's too bad that the balance was never really achieved church-wide throughout the religion. That the Christian priest, the clergy, the Christian clergy as a whole, from the Pope on down, did not embrace what might have been a liberating reform or a liberating change. But it didn't. It was there, and I find it curious. I don't have an explanation for it. What is the explanation for having original thinking, creative men and women, individuals, who, notwithstanding the culture they were raised in, taught, went off on their own? And I don't know. There's something, perhaps it's in the individual, perhaps it has to do with the relation between the divine spirit and human mind, probably does. But there are other factors present. They didn't reform the entire church, which might have avoided a reformation had that been done. And then there's always the material aspects, the indulgences that were paid for in order to be forgiven of your sins. To bring it down to money matters was most unfortunate, and couldn't last forever. The contradiction is so obvious that you can't represent the God on earth, as the claim might be, on the one hand, and then expect financial compensations to forgive sins on the other hand. That kind of materialism simply won't hold up. That's the other side of the difficulty. It wasn't just totalitarian. In some ways, it was simply self-centered. Financially speaking, very self-centered. The reach of authority went into many, many areas. It's just that I wouldn't want to characterize the whole Christian world, the whole Christian church, by only totalitarian descriptors, because that might create an error in the other direction.
Charles, as usual, you have delved into many fascinating sidelines, and I have a dilemma in picking out which particular element on which I think it's worthwhile to comment. In particular, your remarks about Thomas Aquinas are interesting. He indeed was able to develop a coherent theological framework in which he sought to blend the philosophy predominantly of Aristotle with the teachings of the Christian faith. And what I would point out to you is that after he had lived and completed his work, then the Catholic Church made his work a kind of dogma, a kind of doctrine. And then it became incorrect or even sinful to disagree with the analysis of Thomas Aquinas. So here we have the reach of authority, in effect, grabbing onto and determining what could be accepted from Aquinas and what could not. And in terms of the general possibilities that you've talked about of original thinking, each of these philosophers, each of these theologians who had some idea of originality was acutely aware of the danger of being hauled before an inquisitorial court and cited for heresy. And indeed, that happened. It was not imaginary. The church proclaimed its authority in all regards and punished any intellectual or anyone else who, in fact, went contrary to one of its doctrines or teachings, or just the policies that the hierarchy was maintaining at the time. I don't know if you would like to respond to what I've just said, or should I proceed on to others?
Well, just briefly, Teresa is now the term is father of the church, one of the fathers, even though she's a woman, but it's more a philosophical, theological designation, not anthropomorphic, of course. Teresa in the 20th century, I think it was the 1960s, one of the popes, or sometime mid-century, made her a doctrine of the church, that she was to be, her writings were to be, they're elevated, even though she died around the 1580s, around 1582, 83. It shows you the humanity, the imperfection. Human imperfection has many different facets to it that fascinate me as a teacher, from a teacher's point of view. Even an error can be helpful sometimes. It can be stimulative in the search for truth. It just fascinates me how, and I attribute these kinds of inconsistencies that over time might reveal an underlying consistency to the influence of God the Father, the universal Father, and how He can take sin and error and evil and weave out of it a pattern of virtue over time, over human time. And by the way, when the Inquisition, when the agent came and confiscated her book, which I think, I'm trying to get the title, is Celestial something, in which she saw 7 different spheres. It's not entirely, it's somewhat akin, a little akin to the mansion world description. At least there seems to be some similarities. But she said she saw them, or at least she saw them as a visionary would see them. And with the third eye, to paraphrase something, her book was returned to her. It's somewhere in Spain now, I've forgotten where. And because she wrote it obviously in manuscript. It was returned to her, and the explanation she was given was they couldn't quite figure out what it actually claimed. They couldn't determine if it was an opposition to Scripture or not an opposition to Scripture, or somewhat in opposition, somewhat in favor, or they had to give. So they decided to act to her favor. Now she established quite a few monasteries and her own monastic tradition. I mean, she was very loyal to the church during the latter part of the Reformation. She sided with the church's positions in contradistinction to the Protestant world. She was opposed to the Protestant Reformation, Protestant actions. She was a loyal daughter of the church, for sure. And yet, but even she had her book for a while confiscated. What these inconsistencies, and sometimes latter-day consistencies, add up to, I'm not entirely sure, other than to say it somehow seems to reflect facets, as a jewel has facets, of human imperfection. And for that reason, it's difficult for me to be an absolutist. To the extent that I am, it's almost entirely personal. In other words, I have personal prescriptions for myself, but I don't presume a new ism or a new religion or a new this, a new that to proselytize to others. That I find an anathema. But that's my point of view. But some people do, and I've heard people say that about the Urantia book, that it could be used as to assert itself over and push aside other kinds of theologies, perhaps even push aside science. I think over time, the Spirit of God and the human mind, the better aspects of the human mind, the more receptive aspects to grace, that is to say, do interact. And Christianity might yet benefit from that. And if it does, then the world would at least directly or indirectly benefit.
Thank you, Charles. George, I would like to try to refocus this discussion back in a more general framework. I tried to get some reaction from Charles about the set of three words, facts, meanings, and values, and whether those three words, facts, meanings, and values, can be broadly associated with matter, mind, and spirit. And in effect, whether this range of realities, matter, mind, and spirit, is indeed the menu of possibilities that we have as human beings, and indeed all finite beings have to deal with in the world, and which should not be under the authority of any single group. George, would you try that one, please?
Well, I don't know. Could you broaden the question and make it more comprehensive? That was a
all
joke.
right. To try it again.
That was a joke.
Facts, meanings, and values, matter, mind, and spirit, connected, no, or different, and subject to different rules and different groups of people to interpret.
Okay. Sorry for my little bit of humor there.
Well, I couldn't tell that you were making the joke, but that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. Short answer, yes. Matter, mind, and spirit are directly related to things, meanings, and values, and that is how we have to look at our experience if we're going to get a complete understanding, to the extent that we're able to get a complete understanding. In other words, just looking at the material, let's look at different philosophies. Materialism says only matter exists, so it ignores mind and spirit. And Spiritism says that only spirit exists, so it ignores the realities of matter and mind. So, you can choose. You can choose whatever philosophy you want. I choose the one put forward by the Urantia book, which was also the original, philosophy in its original conception, such as is found in the ancient Greeks, was always about the interrelationship between quality, quantity, and meaning, or things, meanings, and values. You always, the two poles of Greek philosophy are Plato and Aristotle. Plato was all about the inner world, and Aristotle was all about the outer world. I'm making an overly general statement, but there's an essential truth to that. Aristotle was much more of a scientist than Plato, and Plato was much more of a idealist than Aristotle. So in terms of this two-page paper that you submitted, I have I don't think he actually considers he starts off, his primary concern is with the problem of knowledge. And philosophically, this is the subject matter of epistemology. And he only considers the problem of knowledge with respect to secular facts. He's with regard to the inner world, the problem of religious truths discerned in the inner world. He just says, there's not enough time to talk about it. So he puts it aside. So his only concern in this paper is his epistemological problem is this: how can we reliably distinguish between the knowledge of the natural world that is certain and knowledge that is doubtful? From a religious perspective, it would be the difference between what is true and what is incorrect. But he does not consider that problem. So he's dealing with secular knowledge, and he makes the point that if the problem of the certainty of secular knowledge is answered or addressed using authoritative religious dogma, then, quote, the debate is not about the nature of truth, but about how a text or holy maxim is to be understood, which I entirely agree with that statement. The spiritual truths of religion are ultimately validated by faith, not by secular knowledge, ecclesiastical authority, though some think so, or traditional doctrines. The certainties of faith can't be used to reliably distinguish between certain and doubtful knowledge about the natural world. There's plenty of evidence of that. We don't need to go into it. And he concludes this two-page, at the end of the second page, he basically says the certainty of secular knowledge is most reliably determined empirically. That is, by using the rational scientific method. Again, something I agree with, and something which is, of course, really wasn't present in the time period that you're talking about. So, I don't know, I kind of wandered off the reservation here, but I'll leave it there unless you have an additional question.
George, thank you. I would simply comment that you have in fact anticipated some of the subsequent points in this article. I have a motion from Bob, whom I will recognize shortly, but I would like to comment in a way that strengthens your point. The lecturer in philosophy is partly making a statement in defense of his own discipline. Philosophy, in effect, is situated between religious truths and scientific facts. There are passages in the Urantia book that I could not put my finger on off the top of my head, which in effect portray the usefulness of philosophy in helping human beings to interpret the differing demands of religion and science. And so the author of this piece, a professor who lectures on philosophy, is partly defending his discipline of philosophy as being a vehicle for reasoning that stands between religion and science. Bob, you would like to proceed? You're again muted, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the button didn't hit right away. Thanks, Neil. I guess that's why we have a couple hours here, because we've spent almost an hour just on a paragraph and a half, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. So these are very, very weighty and important subjects. Something Charles said made me think about that last sentence in the first paragraph. Charles said that Thomas Aquinas said that reason is an ally of faith. And, of course, Neil, you added to what I said about thing, meaning, and value, fact, fact, meaning, and value, matter, mind, and spirit. The revelators deal in these triads, but they definitely want us to understand the three facets of reality, including personality, which is the real revelatory facet for how they introduced it. George has done such great work on personality. I would turn that back over to him. But it sort of occurred to me that last sentence, I think the point can be made, at least it is for me, from what Charles said, that if we change the word from a religious problem and read it with secular in there, as we're going to read section 8 of paper 194, secular totalitarianism. Let me read this and then make my point. Something momentous takes place when a culture takes the position that the problem of knowledge is essentially a is a secular problem. You could put secular in there, you could put scientific in there, and invest its credulity in a denominated group of official interpreters whose judgments on matters of this kind are taken to be incorrigible. I think that's where we're headed with section 8, with secular totalitarianism, and that point is made from both directions. And Charles rightly says that, or I think, certainly in my opinion, Thomas Aquinas had a pretty good idea back in the 13th century that reason is an ally of faith, and you could say it bidirectionally. Faith is an ally of reason. And that's why when the second sentence in the second paragraph, where he says that my own guess is that for every secularly produced fact, there may be some profound religious truth on which it depends. It requires a mind to be able to philosophically approach that particular idea in two directions. And that's my only point that I wanted to make, just to add to this. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Bob. Your comments, again, in this instance, have been quite useful. I think the substitution of secular in that sentence indeed points to the opposite difficulty. What I've been arguing, or have been attempting to suggest, is that what is needed is a balance of all three factors: matter, mind, and spirit. And that when one factor seeks to dominate all three and control the other two, then we have a problem. And indeed, as you have said, if materialism is going to control all other aspects of life, that is a huge issue, as we will find in the section called Secular Totalitarianism, Section 8 of Paper 195. In the period of the 1,000 years that I have focused on, at least initially at the beginning of this at the beginning of this webinar, we have a period in which religion or doctrine or theology assumed to dominate all aspects of life. And that was an unbalanced situation of intellectual tyranny and, to some degree, philosophic tyranny. The lecturer in philosophy, the professor who wrote this document, felt that that assertion, in effect, eliminated his job, because if he was no longer free to think and analyze creatively, then there is no room for philosophy. Doreen, would you like to add something here on your own views of this admittedly rather difficult proposition?
Well, minimally. I would say how the Urantia book teaches us how material mind and spirit mind and matter all penetrate one another. And you question, how does that work? You know, how does one operate and penetrate the other? How did God create this and put it all together that we're able to go from one extreme to the other? So it's innate in us. And if you deny that something exists and you shut people down and say that your mind doesn't matter what you say, and even if you penetrate into the wisdom of God and to know what comes into you through the Spirit, you're not allowed to say anything. You don't question authority. I can't imagine how anybody could grow as a human being if they're shut down and not able to penetrate mind and God consciousness and listen to somebody who thinks they're an authority on everything. It just doesn't work. And of course it couldn't work. It worked long enough, but I'm surprised that it didn't work. It didn't end earlier. But because, of course, if you questioned, you were put to death or excommunicated or burnt or whatever the punishment was. It's just that the beauty of the Urantia book, it allows you all three to understand that mind, matter, and spirit, and how God allows it to operate within us, that we could penetrate all through, all three aspects, and then to know into the world of the divine at some point. But the church, being the divine power and the authority, how did they come to name themselves that in that identity? it just was words. It meant nothing. So this guy is saying, it does cause paralysis. Philosophy, yes, it's not. It comes first. You have to have an idea, and then you have to relate to it, and then you have to observe, and through science, and each one works with the other. But to eliminate half of it or most of it, you don't come to any kind of understanding and conclusions. So again, I'm not going to repeat myself, but I still find that it doesn't compute in my brain how they come to their conclusions, how the rulers, the church authority, how they came to their understanding of these things. Who told them? Who told them that this was this? That everything that happened to them was evil, or they were sinful, or it was something that they did. They didn't even look outside of it. I don't think there was any science. If that's science, I know there were charlatans. Even in the West, they used to have these guys going around and they give you some bottle of some liquid and tell you it's going to heal yourself. They were always charlatans, but I believe the church was a charlatan at that time. I believe everything that they perpetrated on society, on their domain, was just so fallacious and sad. And to me, it was more, I can't say it was evil, but I think it's more sinful. I think they are the ones who perpetrated the sin. And that's my analysis.
Thank you. What you have contributed was very useful. It certainly had to do with the psychology that was, in effect, a domineering psychology at the time. I would partly repeat myself by emphasizing that during this era, the hierarchy of the established institutional Christian church had a monopoly on education. There were no schools run by the governments of those days. Education was in Latin, not in German, not in French, not in English. It was all under the authority of the clerics who were teaching a very small proportion of the population. Most people were illiterate. And I think that reality of domination and monopoly at least goes a fair distance to answering your question of how they could get away with it. The other point, in terms of what they came up with, has to do with a principle that we examined quite early when we began discussing Christianity. They made it up as they went along.
That's for sure.
Jesus did not teach anything about the principles of marriage. They made it up. And they made it up as they went along for whatever practical or ideological or opportunistic reasons that were appropriate to them at the time. And this was the power-oriented preference of the hierarchy to dominate matter, mind, and spirit in all aspects of civilization. And we can be repelled by it, but it is what happened. The governments of the day, to the degree that they existed through much of this 1,000-year period, did not have any answer to this total domination of culture and civilization that the established church carried out. Most of those governments, again, to the degree that they existed, were in partnership with it. Most of the rulers depended on clerics as their advisors, as their secretaries for keeping records, for recording laws. And all these clerics had a monopoly on Latin, which was the vehicle for written expression and records of the time. So in effect, there was a monopolistic approach to all aspects of knowledge and also all aspects of culture on the part of the organized institutional church. I think I would like to proceed. I'm sorry, Doreen, you'd like to add?
Just add one little thing that I came across. It said even Luther saw logical arguments as dangerous to Christianity. I was really surprised. He said to be a Christian, you must pluck out the eye of reason And he said, and referred to reason as the devil's whore. I mean, I was just, Luther?
Well,
What was he afraid of?
I am not quite as shocked that Luther said something like this. He was an authoritarian person. It was just that he wanted his teachings to dominate instead of the Roman Catholic Church's teachings. Luther, for example, met with other Protestants from Switzerland who had a different view of certain theological points. He blew up at them. He disagreed. He said, I'm going back to Germany, and my people in Germany are going to have it my way. And if you want to go back to Switzerland and teach your way, well, that's up to you. But I'm not buying any of this. So the principle of the authority of group teaching for the sake of conformity of belief was not set aside by the Protestant Reformation. The different groups imposed authority from their own perspective with regard to their own teachings. I would nevertheless like to proceed to the next paragraph. George, in effect, quoted some of the words, but I wonder if I could get Charles to read that paragraph, which starts, once one confers on a select and denominated group.
Sure. Once one confers on a select and denominated group, ultimate epistemological authority on core questions arises from the problem of knowledge. Once that's conferred, the nearly inevitable result is philosophical paralysis. What is more likely to happen is positions will become quite hardened. The only thing left for scholarship is to interpret the words of the wise. So the entire debate now is not a debate about the nature of truth, but about how a text or holy maxim is to be understood. What the leaders of thought in the ancient Greek world might be inclined to say is that this may be the best way to get to heaven, but surely not to the moon. Well, Luther did write, every man is his own priest. To what extent he, theologically speaking, would apply that, how far he would take that in vis-a-vis opinions, differing positions, I don't know. But he did write it, and apparently the church hierarchy, power structure, on a theological level, saw that as threatening. If every man's his own priest, then you don't need a hierarchy, particularly, or do you? But it seems to me you wouldn't, or you need less of it. And you do see that in the Protestant world. And in one of the most extreme examples would be the Puritans would not use the word church. They insisted on the term meeting house, so that what is essentially a 17th century town hall would also serve as a meeting. To them, it was a sign of humility. Church, they thought, was presumptuous by human beings. I'm not sure what Professor Robinson is getting at here. If you consider this problem, an inevitable result is philosophical paralysis. I suppose it is. That does occur, and it will occur. But I don't think it's because of religion per se. I think there's something much deeper in the human mind or human thought patterns and emotional spectrum that lends itself to authoritarian and even in many cases totalitarian reactions. Certainly people today, I find many examples of using science in a way similar to the latter Middle Ages. In other words, the least dogmatic and sometimes mocking a disagreement, a contrary thesis. I don't think he does say, I don't presume to weigh the claims of religion, the claims of the secular world. Well, he certainly does. He does address aspects of that, or at least the results of that, or facets of it. But you have to weigh the claims of religion, the claims of the secular world. So I would argue that undoubtedly, in many respects, both the secular world has legitimate claims, that is, true claims. They're not delusions, they're real. And the same thing, ditto, for claims of religion. I'm not altogether certain what the larger point is, however. Certainly, there is a totalitarian character. There appears to be. History does teach this. To the latter medieval church, but I'm not convinced that it's due altogether to Christianity. In other words, the best in Christianity did produce counterpoints or countervailing thinking and actions. And it's also true that civilization needs in the macro sense, civilization seeks a unifying, synthesizing, sovereign authority and power to run society, human society, to make society function. And in the earlier Middle Ages, there was a decentralization of society with the fall of the Roman Empire. It seems to me that the Christian world was that unifying power, and it's not surprising as such it spilled over into the political realm and the economic realm, etc., particularly the political realm, in the union of church and state on different terms. That it failed ultimately is not to be surprising from the point of view of history. The current tendencies, the last, at least 150 years, more or less, of the dogma of science will have the same fate. Indeed, it appears to be atheism, secularism, totalitarianism, appears to be, from the 20th century onward, or later 19th century onward, failing in terms of credibility. And again, I don't want. I think it may be an error, though it's tempting, to overemphasize the religious impulses, the religious drives in the human heart, human mind, human soul, as a primary example in history of that's wicked. In the Urantia book, they do talk about secular totalitarianism. It is interesting that totalitarians deny God. Karl Marx did as early as 1848. He intellectually, conceptually made a war not only on the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and the upper class, the aristocracy. He also made a war on the church generally, Christianity generally, and God in particular. Never understood why. I never could find in his manifesto any reason for the last two attacks. Perhaps he thought he was avoiding the problem of the medieval totalitarianism. I don't know for sure. But I think the claims of the secular world should be acknowledged and recognized and dealt with, and the claims of religion, the religious world, should also be recognized, acknowledged, and dealt with in any case. I'll stop my meandering.
Thank you, Charles. I think we are all in agreement on the idea of a balance involving all three elements, namely matter, mind, and spirit. I would like to shift gears slightly by taking a contrary view of the middle of the paragraph that you read and pose a question to George. The middle of that paragraph says, the only thing left for scholarship is to interpret the words of the wise. So the entire debate is not a debate about the nature of truth, but about how a text or holy maxim is to be understood. Now, turning this a bit playfully, are we in danger of that in regard to focusing so intently on the Urantia book by focusing on how to interpret the teachings of the Urantia book so that this becomes, in effect, our sole window on truth? George, what do you say?
It's your question goes back to the where we started, the problem of knowledge. I mean, how do you know what's true? How do you know what's false? I mean, what are your criteria? This is always the problem in not just in philosophy, but in every aspect of experience. You know, you experience something. How do you know what you're experiencing corresponds to anything outside, either objectively in the material world or objectively in the spirit world? And how do you know? That's the key question, you know, behind everything. Because if you can't have some degree of certainty about what you think you know, then you're paralyzed. Now, in terms of this quote that you reference, this reference to interpreting the words of the wise just goes back to this idea that the truth has already been laid down, and you just have to figure out what the wise people who laid it down meant. And the debate isn't about the truth. The truth has already been settled. Like some people like to say the science has been settled. 500 years ago, the truth was settled. The truth is there. You just have to learn to understand and interpret it correctly. So the issue, you know, I'm a person with the thing that drew me to the Urantia book more than anything else was my perception of a certain quality of truth in it. Everybody's got their own explanation for what it is in the Urantia book that attracts them. For me, that was what attracted me, for whatever reason, and it still does. So, to me, it was always about the question of truth. What's true and what's not true? And so, yes, I really do use the Urantia book as a standard of truth, and I'm not afraid to admit it. I'm not afraid of being called a fundamentalist or of being not subtle enough to know that I'm being manipulated. I don't believe I am. I believe that I discern a level of truth in the Urantia book which surpasses any sort of truth I've discerned in anything else. So if I use it as a standard, that's why. I don't know if that answers your question, but I suppose you could say I do tend to view pretty much everything through the filter of the Urantia book. If it disagrees with what I think I understand from the Urantia book, I'm inclined not to give it very much weight.
George, you have made a valiant attempt to go at my question, and I think I agree with just about everything you've said. For the sake of making the question even more complicated than it has to be or than it was before, I think it is useful to look at the Urantia book with a filter, dividing its content into different categories. Spiritual truths, religious truths of great magnitude and importance, the words of Jesus about God and the nature of human beings in relation to God seem to me part of the first category, whereas the revelators themselves say that the cosmology that they have put into the teachings of the Urantia book is not inspired, and that many facts will soon be found to transcend their elements of cosmology. And I would say probably that there is a third category of material in the Urantia book. There are comments about society and civilization, about marriage and so on, which probably does not have the automatic approval as we would normally accord to the truths of religion and the nature of God and the personality of individuals and so on. But maybe it is a little bit more solid in terms of its basis on reality than the cosmology that the revelators themselves have said is subject to improvement and is not inspired. So, all right, George, I'll give it back to you. I was going to turn to Bob, but go ahead.
I just quickly to respond. That statement about cosmology, which is always brought up as an example of why you shouldn't take what you read in the Urantia book as necessarily true, is deceptive, because at the beginning of that sentence where they talk about how cosmology need to be updated, they say that all of the facts that we present in this book will stand the test of time. So the facts, including scientific facts, historical facts, now they specifically reference historical facts, but they're saying it's not the facts that will be overthrown or become obsolete or be replaced by new facts. There are a lot of facts in the Urantia book, and one of the facts in the Urantia book has to do with their stated fact that the Urantia book, that the universe revolves around paradise. That's not scientific knowledge. That's a stated fact. So yes, there are lots of details, scientific details, which will need to be updated. But basic scientific view of the universe presented in the Urantia book will not need to be updated, particularly since no one has ever conceived of the universe looking like this to begin with. There is no human record of anyone ever conceiving of universe consisting of space levels revolving around an absolute center of the universe where is located the Isle of Paradise. So this is, yes, I get a little worked up because I keep hearing this about, oh, well, you can't, listen to everything in the Urantia book because, it could be updated and needs to be revised and needs to be changed. That won't change. Let me put it differently. If the universe does not revolve around an absolute center, then the Urantia book can't be an epical revelation.
George, I recognize that I put you on the spot in effect, and that it is a difficult proposition. I was not trying to criticize anything specific in the Urantia book. Effectively, I was trying to do a triage of three different kinds of propositions that we find in the Urantia book. The first kind being essentially spiritual, and the second kind being fact-based or cosmologically significant, and the third kind, information about society and the development of society and where it could go. And what I was suggesting was perhaps that we need a fairly nuanced view of how we look at these different elements in the Urantia book, even though it is indeed the fifth epical revelation. Bob, I've probably made the question as complicated as possible, but in any event, you have a chance of uncomplicating it if that's what you wish to do.
We'll give it a try. It's a fabulous question, and it's certainly one that's germane to what we're talking about here today. And I am going to use that word, nuance. I was going to say, well, a lot of things George has said I completely agree with about these facts, about the universe. But I do take a nuanced view as to what your question was, and I think your question is, are we going to accept the fact or the idea or the concept similar to where either secular totalitarianism or theological totalitarianism was, or is there some center point where these papers that we've been provided by various revelators provides us a modicum of facts and truth? So if we go up the continuum, there's data, information, knowledge, and these are concentric circles, so to speak. So I know what data is. Information is correlated data. Knowledge is actionable information is probably the best definition. And then we always move to wisdom, and we draw these little lines and say, well, this is the progression of how the human mind goes. Just to baseline the answer to your question, I treat the Urantia book very much like George does, of course. in that but it provides me, the way I perceive it is that it provides me a scaffolding. And George, I'm not going to say the words that you said exactly, but it's like what I read, about the universe, for example, just to use yours as an example, provides me the leverage, the catalyst, the scaffolding by which to do more understanding, to do more research, to build upon facts. And the Reveltors, I think what they mean that it's not inspired is that don't treat this as the word of God. Jesus said, when you see me, you see the Father. He didn't say, when you hear me, you hear the Father. So that's important to think about. One of the interesting statements that I want to follow up with is in paper 196, the very last paper. It's called The Supremacy of Religion. Very simple statement, a very simple sentence. It says that the human mind does not create real values. Human experience does not yield universe insight. Concerning insight, the recognition of moral values and the discernment of spiritual meanings, all that the human mind can do is discover, recognize, interpret, and choose. And I think that's what the papers have provided. They have provided a place for us to begin to do some rediscovery, recognize some of the facts that are going to lead us to some truth. We have to interpret that based upon this cosmic dimension that they've provided, and then make a choice. And as Charles said a couple of webinars ago, matter of fact, I think he said it a couple of times in different webinars, sincerity, 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 decisions, 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 choosing, choosing, choosing. But in that order, we have to discover, recognize, interpret, and choose. And that's what how I see it as a scaffolding. I'm kind of using that as the term to say that no, it's not the word of God, of course. There are some amazing facts that may get embellished or may turn into different kinds of information as these facts get recorrelated. Another 300 or 400 or 500 years down the road, as we can send space probes out into these different areas, just to use that as an example. And the other point I want to make is from paper 194 about Spirit of Truth. We had talked a little bit about this in a previous webinar. So the last point I want to make is that the Spirit of Truth came at Pentecost, of course, the time of the Jewish Pentecostal time. And to understand what the Spirit of Truth is, I think is a very difficult and almost semi-mysterious, but in fact we can, we can discover what at least the Midwayers say about it. And there's one sentence where it says, "Thus it appears that the Spirit of Truth comes really to lead all believers into all truth, into the expanding knowledge of the experience of living and the growing spiritual consciousness of the reality of eternal and ascending sonship with God." The Spirit of Truth works on knowledge. And the idea that I took from something that Chris Halverson had said at some point, and I've kind of kept this idea, but I think it applies here very well, and that's this idea of a substrate. It appears to me that a substrate is like algae living on rocks. The rock is the substrate of algae, and the algae will be a substrate for some other living being. And what happens is that the substrate interacts with what's on top of it, and it produces these new products. Somehow, in this process, the Spirit of Truth is like a substrate, and then it's working with our increased knowledge. That's why I think this is such an important topic for us to talk about here today. As we gain better facts, as we understand the universe a little bit better, only by the balance between faith and reason, because the two have to be balanced, as we've all said here. Only at that point will this Spirit of Truth be able to interact as a substrate and produced new values and meanings for which me to choose from. So I think I answered your question up front and said that these papers provide, yes, they provide new facts. I use it as a fulcrum to say, okay, where do I go from here? I'm going to take this as the basis, but I'm still going to try to employ all of those the spiritual helpers that we've got here, which is in addition to the Spirit of Truth and the Holy Spirit, of course. So back over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Bob. Doreen, I'd like to turn to you because I am vividly aware of comments that you have made from time to time, that in your experience of reading the Urantia book, for example, the words of Jesus, the descriptions of events that happened to him, you did not need to wonder it was true. You knew it was true. There was a direct personal experience of yours. So now applying the general issue that I've been putting for others to comment on, I wonder if you are sympathetic to the thought that those portions of the Urantia book that you react to immediately, knowing that they are true, perhaps do not represent the totality of the Urantia book, that you do not have the same conviction every time you read something. For example, in the paper on the development of government or the nature of marriage and so on. Do you have the same conviction? Yes, this is true, bingo, it rings the bell? Or is there a difference in perhaps the way you react to different passages depending on the underlying subject?
Well, of course, everything that you experience in life, you have to interpret. Now, if you have the information and it gives you an expansion in your understanding, in your mind, to see through different eyes, to understand through a different level of reasoning. The Urantia book, I can go in 100 different areas, and I could talk a long time on this because I love it, not because everything in there is exactly as they say it is. It was irrelevant to me because I read so much. You see, I was always interested in spirituality and my relationship with God. And the rest was all great. It was wonderful to read about the Adam and Eves and the planetary. I had no knowledge of any of that. So that was great. It's all information. It's fine. It doesn't help me to live my life better. What helped me to live my life better, discovery that God is within me, and in what it does, it controls, it adjusts, and it leads you. And that's what the Spirit of God does. So, okay, now I have to see, well, is it true? You see, I do a little science myself. I just never take anything at face value, pretty much, unless I experience it. And then through that, there is an inner knowing. So there's fabulous stuff there. But when I say to you that slowly the Spirit began to dominate my mind, and I became a happier person because of it. And I always was able to, I have a really good ability to feel the Spirit. I just have had it for decades and decades. I could feel it pass through me once in a blue moon, or I could feel them working with me. And that is, I don't care if people believe it or not, I know it. And that has helped me to give me a good sense of that they really care about me. They really love me. And the pattern they have laid out for my life, and how I was able to recognize the pattern from where it all began to where it is today is incredible. I wouldn't have found that on my own if the Urantia book hadn't described it. So there's a depth of understanding. It's extraordinary insights that had given me this depth of consciousness, and to release all the shame and the guilt and all this stuff from you because it's irrelevant. It hasn't got the value. What has value? The family relationships, all the stuff that all of you have spoken about. It is so extraordinary to me. The rest is history and the destiny was marvelous, because who would know that? But I did read a lot of stuff about cosmic consciousness and near-death experiences and all the stuff, and I mean for decades. And I was so prepared. So when I found this, it was this, it spoke to my heart. It just, when I read about God, and it was so exciting, as much as, you know, probably more so at the beginning, because that's what influenced everything else, was because God is so real, and I know it, and now it confirms it. It was like it confirmed I wasn't sure. And I had seen many things. I've had hundreds of experiences that have changed my life. And whether it's the Spirit of Truth, a few times I've had traumatic experiences. But one thing I do know is that they are there all the way, and they're constantly looking out who they are. I cannot discern whether, you know, which spirit agency or angels, but I definitely know the angels always have helped me. And they reveal things to me ahead of its time. And I know that's the Spirit. I used to see the future before the future happened. I just didn't know what I was looking at until maybe a year or 6 months or whatever, that these things came to fruition. So when I read all the stuff around, I understand it, you know, in a great, you know, a great level that I had read in other writings. That, of course, you know, there's so much beautiful philosophers and spiritual people that have discovered this all on their own, without the Urantia book, but through, of course, the depth of the desire to want to know. It's just like when you read what Daniel, they say, or some of the other prophets. Well, how did they come to hear the voice of God? How did they come to that point? It is the desire to me to really focus on what's important. It's not how much I know, and it doesn't matter. So I can't quote all these things, though a lot of people are very smart and they do wonderful, but it's not my forte, and I don't have an interest in doing that. But I have to tell you, during the week, I had something done, and I had an anesthesiologist. He was working with me. So, you know, while he's setting me up and all this, and I tell him, don't kill my brain cells because I don't have that much left. And every time you get anesthesia, I know that it does that to your brain. So we began talking, and I asked him if he had faith, because I wanted to know he shouldn't give me too much anesthesia. So I wanted to know if he had any belief system. And we began talking. And in the end, I have to say, he was so interested in the philosophy that, you know, we study. And I told him, and he said, please send me the information. And I did. And wherever he takes it, it doesn't matter. But it's that enthusiasm. I mean, I wouldn't have normally done that, but that's, to me, the Spirit working within us. It's so exciting. It just energizes my spirit, my personality, to just share whatever it is that maybe people, you know, would love to understand and have for themselves. So if my life was better as a result of this revelation, God bless you, Neil, that I'm sure other people could benefit as well in one way or another. So I will cut short because I know it's wasting a lot of time, and you have more to say.
Well, Doreen, I would not say that it was wasting, but we are indeed pressed for time. I am compelled to try to accelerate this discussion of the 2-page paper by the philosophy professor. We have spent almost an hour and 3/4 on 3 paragraphs, and I would concede to you that the 3 paragraphs we have discussed are the most important. But I believe it's best if I accelerate by reading the remaining portion of the 2 pages, and then we can talk about the idea of empirical and probably the idea of inductive and deductive reasoning as elements of human thought and experience. So I shall try to read it as clearly as possible, starting with the final paragraph on the first page of the lecture excerpt. The Hellenic world was scarcely, devoid of religious influence on all aspects of thought and practice. No question about it, religion is a central fact of ancient Greek life. Consider again Pythagoras, who was a man of great spiritual devotion, a man whose mathematics is seeking to rise to the level of the divine. In Homer as well, whether it is Lyssa or Thymus or anything else invading the body, Homer leaves ample room for the realm of the spirit to operate, and to operate powerfully according to its own principles, these being obscure, powerful, and chthonic. I said in an earlier lecture that the ancient Greek world never had an official religion, but was also never entirely secular either. There is a remarkable integration of the secular and the religious in this robust and flourishing culture in the 5th and early 4th centuries BC. Nonetheless, the Hippocratics give us a particularly useful example of a science that is liberated from religious orthodoxies, an example matched by the productive scholarship of the same period in natural science, political science, psychology, and associated subjects. This is not to say that Hippocratic medicine was superior to what might have been found in Egypt even 500 or 1,000 years earlier, but it is to say that it was based on an entirely different set of presuppositions. Now, throughout these lectures and in philosophy in general, there is a term that is quite commonly used to identify a particular approach to the problem of knowledge. The term is, quote, empirical, unquote. We often hear that one is engaged in empirical research. We describe a philosopher as being an empiricist. We say that science is an essentially empirical enterprise. Now, what do we mean when we use this word? Empirical is grounded in the ancient Greek word empiria, which simply means observation. Now, the Hippocratic physicians describe themselves as empirikoi, each one of being an empirikos. In this, they meant to convey that their remedies were based on what had been observed to be effective, not on some grand theory by which remedies are allegedly deducible. Now, today, if a physician is asked about how medical science approaches disease, the reply is likely to be something like, well, the approach of medical science is empirical, meaning based on clinical observations that tell us when a particular condition is treated in a particular way, certain consequences follow. Those consequences that promote health are taken to be the right kind of therapy, and those consequences that don't do that or make conditions worse are then abandoned. Nowhere in this approach do we find overarching, non-scientific theories or beliefs driving the entire practice. That's the end of the lecture segment. So indeed, I would say to you, colleagues, that the crucial word here is empirical. And indeed, from the perspective of the categories of knowledge that are familiar to me, we have the difference between inductive reasoning, reasoning from facts that have been amassed, and deductive reasoning, reasoning from principles that are considered to be the fountainhead or source of other principles or other conclusions. Charles, would you like to comment on the idea of empirical and the distinction between inductive and deductive reasoning?
Empiricism is a relatively safe approach if you're interested in discerning what is real. It's reasonable, logical, makes a great deal of sense, but it's not the whole of a means to that end. It is an important method to make observations as precise as you can. But then we run into certain difficulties. The peace that passes understanding. One can experience the peace as quite real. and it could have good fruit that's observable by others, but nonetheless not be able to explain it, not to yourself or anyone else. And that's another factor about, yet it comes under the category of a certain kind of knowledge. Human knowledge is somewhat problematic because the human mind is problematic. The human being is problematic. Human life is problematic. With regard to your previous question about the reference to the Rancher book and thinking, real thinking, if you rely just on the book, are you in danger of ending up authoritarian or totalitarian? I would say this. I'll try to be as quick as I can. One observation is this: any book, any text whose authors, some of whose authors, willingly state, "I do not know," at the end of an analysis and a set of generalizations, I don't know what the explanation is very, very healthy. It has enormous integrity, in my way of thinking, great integrity, and is worthy of great respect and credibility. And I would put the revelation in that category, and its truth, beauties, and goodnesses, and its facts, meanings, and values, and its science, philosophy, and religion, and under that. The authors, when they admit they don't know something, are practicing the virtue of humility. The philosophical or intellectual humility from our standpoint, but it's humility. It's a genuine thing, and I would pay very close attention to them for that reason, curiously. Even when they warn you that admitting that the cosmology of certain statements will have to be revised, I agree with what I thought George was making. Our viewpoints may shift on that with further revelation, but the facts are not shifting. You see that in the race, which I had more time to go into as an example. I'd like to make a personal comment, a personal experience. When I made a decision at around the age of 16 to build my life around the search for truth and to maintain a clear mind by not taking anything addictive. Clear mind, but the search for truth was the main focus. And I have. That doesn't mean it was smooth or easy. It was not smooth at times. It was not easy, but I have. I've been true to that. I've been loyal to that. In that context, as a teenager, when I read the book of Genesis in the Bible, I sensed that Adam and Eve were real in some fashion in the history of our world, but not in this, what I thought was a somewhat childish presentation of them. I thought there was a true story about Adam and Eve on the earth. And when I found the Rancher book in my wife's mother's bookcase, and I went to the table of contents and saw there were papers on Adam and Eve, I was thrilled. That was several years later, because I sensed that my inquiry would be justified, that I would find out, I'd have my inquiry satisfied, my questions satisfied about their true historical role. When I read the papers, every sense in me said that this was the real story. This was worthy of a planetary revelation. These were beings who were not childish in some ways, but who were mature and advanced and have come to our world. That made sense to me. I've always credited that insight, such as it may be, to the interaction between the divine spirit and my mind. And so I've come to rely on that interaction between the divine spirit and my mind, and I've tried to hone them. When you take an axe, as I know how to cut a tree down, you have to hone it, the edge, sharpen the edge. You hone the edge. I've honed it, that perception of the divine spirit interacting with my mind and vice versa. There's a reciprocity there. It's reciprocal. And it's a glorious reciprocity. But it's been the basis for how I assess discoveries in the search for truth. When I listen to persons describe their sense of what is true, what is not, determining whether they're fraudulent or whether they're deluded or indeed they are speaking the truth. And that assessment is complex, and there are various criteria that I've learned and honed over the years. The Urantia book practices what it preaches. It encourages original thinking. It factors in human thought patterns as a necessary and integral part of the process of celestial revelation. And the convincer is the statement, a simple statement to a question that some of the authors raise: I do not know. That impresses me the most. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I would like to turn to one more contributor, since we are really operating under a deadline, and this will be George. George, during the webinar today, we have been dealing with a number of words that are crucial. You might even call them buzzwords: matter, mind, and spirit, fact, meaning, value, and now empirical, inductive, deductive. I leave it to you whether you wish to make some comments about how these words relate to each other, or perhaps draw a lesson that you would like to convey from your net take on this discussion today.
Yes, we do have something. Going back to this two-page paper, essentially, I made the point earlier about the certainties of faith. Certainties of faith cannot be used to really distinguish between certain and doubtful knowledge of the natural world. And this conclusion appears consistent with what the book teaches about secular knowledge. But it does not address, Robinson did not address, and we haven't addressed yet, well, we have maybe a little bit, but we haven't really directly addressed the epistemological problem of religious knowledge. How is it possible to be certain about any spiritual truth? We had a little bit of discussion on this, but I'd like to reference something that Melchizedek says in section 6 of paper 102. Faith transforms the philosophic God of probability into the saving God of certainty in personal religious experience. Skepticism may challenge the theories of theology, but confidence in the dependability of personal experience affirms the truth of that belief, which has grown into faith. It's a little bit of a tangled sentence, but the two things which really stand out are the union of faith and, quote, confidence in the dependability of personal experience. Those two things together explain the growth of religious certainty, if I'm interpreting what the Melchizedek is saying correctly. And this confidence in the dependability of personal experience is common to both the religion of Jesus and modern science. Go to paper 195, section 5. Midway says, in religion, Jesus advocated and followed the method of experience, even as modern science pursues the technique of experiment. It's kind of an enlightening statement, at least I found it so. It goes on. We find God through the leadings of spiritual insight, but we approach this insight of the soul through love of the beautiful, pursuit of truth, loyalty to duty, and the worship of divine goodness. So Jesus followed the method of experience in his religious life, which is, they compare it to modern science following the experiential method of empirical experiment. So I guess if you want to stretch a point, you could say both religion and science are based on empiricism of personal experience.
Thank you, George. That was indeed an inspired and I think inspiring selection of passages. I would say that your reference to personal experience is indeed a paraphrase of the religion of Jesus, personal spiritual experience. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we have now finished a very interesting webinar. We will be back next week, and then at that time, we will take up Section 8 in Paper 195 entitled Secular Totalitarianism. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Adios.